Assalamu alaikum, everybody. This is a presentation on Islamic banking, what I call the integrated approach. My response, and this is in response to Dr. Ghamdi's suggestions on Islamic banking, which he has given in a series called Response to 23 Questions. And within that, there's part 20 to 23, which is on interest, soothe, or usury. I appreciate Dr. Ghamdi's thought process that as ulama have to cover so many subjects such as astronomy, agriculture, ethics, sustainability, genetics, all of new topics, there is an opportunity, in fact, there is a need for Muslims who have specialized skills, training and experience in each of these fields to work with the ummah and to take these debates further. I would like to take that suggestion up on the subject of sood and riba, and you will see from the next slide where I've given my profile. That profile is not intended to be a self-glorification exercise, as all glory is to Allah, but it is being shared more as a reference to the education, skill, training, experience, and expertise that is behind the views that I'm going to lay out today. Alhamdulillah, I was able to leave paid employment or advisory work 5 years ago, and I will be happy to work with anybody who wishes to develop, and that on a free of cost basis, should they wish to develop on interest-free models and products. My detailed presentation on Islamic banking was first given in 2003, from where I will use some slides. Unfortunately, nothing much has changed since then. However, I will look to cover anything that is updated since then. And there's a disclaimer there if anybody wants to go through that. Now, one of the other reasons why I'm doing this presentation, I hope that with this response, I will also address the group of scholars, bankers, auditors who are designing and certifying the current modes of Islamic banking being used, practiced globally, and of course in Pakistan also. And the good thing is that when I'm talking, the thing that I look at is whatever Islam has said has to apply in a global situation. And and the reason I'm calling it integrated, Muslims have to be integrated in today's world in every way. We have our beliefs, we have our thoughts, and we have our commandments, but none of them should require us to have to stay away or isolate ourselves. So inshallah, we will look at the thing from a global point of view. And in particular, because of my experience of the financial sector in England, in the UK, and in Hong Kong, and generally globally, the solutions I'm giving are more those that can actually work and apply in a country in the Western system. The other reason for this presentation is that I feel that this will also provide answers to most, if not all, of the 14 questions that the Supreme Court of Pakistan has asked in dealing with the case on riba. I will do a more targeted response in a separate presentation, which can be used in court, but this one for now. Okay, what's the agenda? The agenda today is we're going to look at detailed review, and I'm going to look at it in detail. So I hope you have the time to stay with this presentation. It's not something that you can rush because, mashallah, we are all very, very skilled, and we have 30 years or up to 30, 40 years of experience and skill and preset ideas. Hopefully today what I'm going to say will give a different light on it, and that's the objective. And also, stay with it. Ghamdi Saab took 4 hours. I'll try and cover my thing in about 1 hour or thereabouts. So what I would say is that we're going to do the review of three of the approaches that we're looking at. And we can say there are basically three views, and there may be variations of it, but basically I'm saying there are three views. That modern day banking products is acceptable as is. And I'll call that banking is acceptable view, and this is the one that I have understood that Dr. Ghamdi is suggesting and proposing. So that's how I would call that. The second view is that modern day banking products can be made acceptable with minimal effort. And this is the approach that is being taken by the whole group of people who are propagating the current models of Islamic banking, and I'm calling that the Islamic banking view. And when I say minimal effort, I literally mean the effort that is in the vast majority of current Islamic banking. Now, I'm not saying everything in Islamic banking is wrong, and you'll see later on, inshallah, there's a lot of good in it, but the message is that the majority of the shortcuts that we take in are what I'm calling minimal effort basis. The third is what I'm suggesting, which is called an integrative approach. Here we look at the principles of Quran and Sunnah, and we use all the current knowledge that we have today, and we apply them as strictly as is possible. So inshallah, that is the bulk of what we're going to do. We're also going to look at Dr. Ghamdi's view that on the banking landscape and the bank's role in the economy, and we're going to evaluate that. Then he has made certain points on use of indexation to address inflation. I will also address that, and a review of riba, which is given by borrowers as opposed to that is taken by lenders. We will discuss that as well. Having done that, and we've hopefully addressed all the issues that I see in Dr. Ghamdi's approach and in the Islamic banking approach, I will then lay a brief overview of the suggested solutions that the integrated approach involves. But obviously that is another topic, and it is going to be done in a separate presentation very shortly, inshallah. But if we can look at this, what we've got, and then we can look at it. There's another approach that riba is not banned in Islam at all, but I'm not going to cover that because all three of the views that I've talked about all agree that that is not the case, and therefore it's not a matter of discussion, at least for this group of people. I would also give a counter challenge to Dr. Ghamdi. I'm calling this the 90-day counter challenge, and that is for consensus building. Now, anything I'm going to say today, hopefully nothing new will be in anybody's knowledge. I'm not creating any new information. I'm just putting it in a different light. And what Ghamdi Sahib has said, that is also very well said, noticed. And what Islamic banking says, I think that is very well covered as well. So now the challenge is for all these approaches to sit together on a sort of a round table and be able to conclude. Because at the end of the day, the Ummah, the Muslim followers, they require some guidance from the experts. And all three have different fields and different views. But the challenge is on us to come together and at least get to a point where they agree. I'm happy to be corrected. Anything that I say today, I'm happy to give further information and some further clarity should anybody feel that is required, and that will be. And the whole idea of a roundtable is that let's pick up some of the good ideas from all of them, and then have an agreed, approach that we can all publicly put out. Of course, solutions is not in the 30 days. That will take a lot longer. And we have to be pragmatic and we have to set the direction. And the 90 days only to lay out how we think the industry should proceed. First thing that Dr. Ghamdi said, that things are not about names, but the reality behind them. And Islamic banking says the same, and that's something that I absolutely agree with. Therefore, names are not important. But what we're talking about is important, and to understand what we're talking about, we have to have definitions. Otherwise, we'll be just talking cross purposes. I will be saying car, you will be thinking aeroplane, and so on and so forth. So to avoid that, we're going to have definitions, not because of names, and that is the point. So now, just if you look at the whole galaxy, within that you've got the solar system, within that we've got Earth, within that we've got mankind, within that we've got Muslims, within that we've got the individual ayahs. Okay, so you have to define all of these things. You have to define what is the solar system, you have to somehow define what the earth is, you have to define what man is, and so on and so forth. Not that we're going to do all of that today, but message is that you need to define it. Otherwise, We cannot talk, we cannot have a conversation. So to understand what we're talking about and to subclassify, we require definitions. Now each of these things we talked about will have a definition of its own. But it will be pretty definitive. Over a period of time, it can change a bit. When we talk about the Earth and its atmosphere, we might be talking about 10,000 feet, we might be talking 40,000 feet, we might be talking, a kilometer or a kilometer and a half. But we're not going into the domain where once you've gone into space and you can see the Earth from outside. Well, that's not part of Earth. That's then part of the solar system. So definitions are pretty defined, except somewhere along the line you will have to put some dividing line, and that dividing line can move a bit, but overall it's going to be clear. The other thing is, name is not important, I agree with that, but once you identify and once you define, you need to identify and label something and say this is what we were talking about. For example, if you're talking about a human being, a specific human being, then you need to be clear about it once you identified him, either through facial recognition or electromagnetic field. However you've recognized him, you then have to label him. And let's say you label me with my telephone number, because Ayaz Ahmed, there's millions of, I don't have that many named people, but you have lots of. And you decide to identify me as the individual with a telephone number. And that telephone number then becomes unique to me. Now note that even if there's one digit change in that telephone number, you'll be addressing somebody else, your call will go to somebody else. So let's be clear, this nomenclature business is only for definitions and it's only for identification. And examples of that is night turns to day and day turns to night. There is some distinct point when day stops being a day and night and it becomes night. Now those two broad things are very much defined and everybody can see that. But in between you will have sunset. Now there's still light around and it is sunset, sun has set. So you need to have some definition and you need to clear that. And similarly dawn has to be defined. And anthropology will tell you that there's a direct correlation between the importance of something in your life and the number of words that exist in the language for that object. Why? To remove ambiguity. So if you have a few names and they all mean different things, there's no harm in further differentiating them. For example, Eskimos will have the most number of words for ice because their life depends on it. And French will have a whole dictionary of words for alcohol because they love it. So whichever reason you have, you will need more words if you want to describe things in more detail. And when I look at the Quran, and I'm saying one of the objectives of today is to look at modern knowledge and relate that to the Quran. Surah Rahman, when I read it very recently, suddenly I got these that I thought it might be referring to big data and individual recognition and identification, and partly genome technology, where that's para 39 and 41, when it says, that day no man or jinn will be asked about his sin. So beautifully put. What does it mean? It means that all the data will already have been collected and it would have been in one place, and there will be clarity and there will be total data about what you did and all the sins that you did and all the good things you did. And therefore it says, that day no man or jinn will be asked about his sins. Everything will be on record. So that's the big data that I see of today. The next paragraph, one that comes to mind, is immediately after that. It says, the evildoers will be recognized by the darkness of their faces. Now, what does that mean? Again, that whole data that we said about the sin of somebody has to be identified and linked to him. So when you're referring to him and his amal or his data, then that has to be connected. And obviously, which of the lords of your blessing will you both deny? But that's for later, and inshallah, I'll leave that to more of the science experts. I'm more a finance expert. but an engineer as well, as you will have seen in my profile. So, definitions. What is a bank? So that becomes the first point of discussion today. And Ghamdi Saab rightly said, and I agree with all of these points, that the bank is a reality. Banks are reality and are operating widely. Banks are conglomerates, are offering multiple services. They're all businesses operating within defined laws, and they operate in one of the most regulated space that you can have. However, we still need to define a bank and look at it, and that's what I'm going to do next. Before I do that, quick look at the business structure. Just recapping, basically there's nothing new here. You have an organization in the middle there. It's funded by equity and or debt, and it has assets. This is the statement that all accountants will tell you that the first thing they learned about accounting, that equity plus debt equals assets. Okay. When I look at debt, there are two types of debts. There's the bond, the loan, whatever you want to call it, and there is debt that arises from transactions, which are called creditors. On the asset side, you can either have a direct asset holding, which could be a computer, a factory, a car, an aeroplane, or you could have financial assets. And the financial assets include the debtor, which is the corollary to the creditor. It could be holding bond B, which could be the bond, similar to an organization. So that's how the cycle continues. Or you could be holding equity in entity B. So that's the broad organization structure. One other thing I want to just clear up before we go. I mean, we tend to spend a lot of time thinking about whether, is it what it is. But I would say that it's the same coin with two sides. Often you can have a sale which is for you, it could be a purchase for the counterparty, you could be the donor, you could be the donee, renter, etc. And income can become cost for him. So when I'm talking, generally I'll be talking, covering both sides of the transaction. But if I want to be very specific, I will narrow down. And a loan is a depositor, and a depositor is a loan. So there are words that you can interchange, and we will use them in the generic sense first. And if I want to further define it, we will do so. So what is the definition of a loan, and then therefore and interest? Well, a loan is very clear, both in terms of general usage, and the technical term is also aligned. Loan is the giving of something that will be consumed with a commitment to give the same quantity back, of the same thing back. And it has unique characteristics and impact. But basically what we're saying is that, like if I give you a sack of dates, you're going to consume it, you're not going to hopefully give me the same dates back, reprocessed, but you will give me another sack of dates whenever the promise date comes. Similarly, if I give you $5,000 today as a loan, you will give me $5,000 back in the period of time. So it's pretty clear. And there's the clarity that comes to mind is when I look at the IFRS preface. IFRS, as you all know, is the International Accounting Standards, and I call that like the Bible of today's modern finance. And when I say IFRS, I'm again referring generically to the literature in modern finance, and particularly the IFRS. And you'll see why. So it's important that we understand IFRS doesn't mean literally that book. It is primarily that book, but all the literature that goes around supporting it. And the way it's described in IFRS, and interestingly, the IFRS definition is not somewhere in the deep down in some chapter. It's not even in the first chapter. It's in the preface. And the preface, when something is in the preface, it means that this is really important and it's endemic throughout the whole thought process. So let's say in the preface, it describes finance, debt, and equity. And in doing so, the definition you can look at in more detail if you want, but what I would call, it says they are mutually exclusive. Those of, remember in school we did these Venn diagrams, and mutually exclusive means that they do not overlap. If it is one, it's not the other, and if it's the other, it's not going to be one. Now, that is the level of clarity that exists. And similarly, it defines interest as any increase in a loan arising from a loan, and profit any increase arising from equity. So since the fundamental producers of the income are mutually exclusive, and therefore you could say that interest and general income, profit, is also mutually exclusive. And the clarity is very much there in the hadith and also in the pre-Quranic times. And if you look at the teachings of the Jewish scholars today to their students, they explain that exactly as we are saying that. And if somebody says, "What's interest? I don't understand it," the sunnats, and there's lots of references. I've tried to keep this presentation simple and not put all the references in. But if anybody wants to, because we're dealing with Dr. Ghamdi and we're dealing with Islamic banking scholars, we can we understand what's being talked about. And the Sunnah says that you cannot take a ride or take any benefit, even the shade of a tree, or even a very strong thank you. And that also is exactly the same as is in the Jewish faith. It was clear 1500 years before, it was clear at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and it is clear 1500 years now. So if anybody says there's confusion in that, I'm happy to have an offline discussion with them. The other good thing is that I think we all agree, the three groups of the discussion, is that riba is haram, and it is given so very clearly. And we can call this, let's say, core riba, and all three agree on that. Now, the other thing is riba interest. Once the definition is any increase, then other words can be used to describe it, like zulm, exploitative, usury, but they are not part of the definition because any includes all of those. So if anybody says interest only becomes interest when it is zulm, no, that would be a subset. It only becomes a problem when it is usury. No, that's a subset of it. Riba is banned, riba is defined as any, and therefore I would like to argue that closes that subject of zulm, exploitative, usury, rate, all of those. Any increase is riba, any increase is interest, and we'll use those words interchangeably. And this was made very clear in the Quran, Surah Baqarah 275, in which they said people will question the difference between trade and riba, but they have been equated to madness. So someone is saying to you, what are you talking about? This is madness. Now, I wouldn't have said this, but the Quran says it. The Quran says it because it says people will say this, and the answer is that there is not much to discuss here. It is clear. It is clear, and so it is in IFRS, so it is 3,000 years ago, and so it is during the time of the Prophet. Anybody who tries to do that contradiction will be counterproductive, and to the cause of establishing a Sharia-compliant business finance model. Okay, we're going to look at the hierarchy of transactions, because obviously within the whole transaction gambit, this is my breakup, so it's obviously everything that I talk about today is subject to discussion and can be. I've broken down transactions into what I call asset-based and service-based. Within the assets, further definition between permanent transfer and temporary transfer. And then within permanent transfer, I've got spot payment and deferred payment. Within the temporary transfer, I have the recipient is either consuming it or it is non-consuming item for the recipient. And then there's one further classification that comes: if he's not consuming it and he's holding it temporarily, then what is happening? Is he utilizing it or is he not utilizing it? Now, based on these definitions, I then have put down what the product comes out and then later on what's the income definition of those products. So, for example, if you sell an asset on a permanent transfer basis on spot, that's a pure sale and that gets you pure profit. If I take a temporary asset-based temporary transfer which is consumed by the recipient, then I get a loan. And against the loan I put that you get, that leads to interest. And then similarly everything has been defined. So I'll give you a few minutes to look at that. And I think I've covered everything. Now on the services side, while there may be multiple types of service, but generically there is no asset and therefore all types of services arising from service-based transaction will be some form of fee, commission, etc. Sorry, one thing I forgot to add, that if it's transferred temporarily to somebody else, there will also be a corresponding gain or loss that will arise by holding that, and that is to the benefit of the owner as it is. Okay, what is a bank? We're still on that question. Let's not forget that. The governor of the Bank of England, or the FSA as it was called, was addressing a conference on Islamic banking in Dubai sometime around 2003, and asked the question, "What makes a bank a bank?" And his own answer was, which still is absolutely true, that the bank is a unique entity that promises to pay back the principal of the depositor. He said that it might not be able to, and bank failures we all know do happen, but it promises to. And when it promises to, then all the need for banking laws and regulations is to ensure that the bank follows business models and processes and takes risks that make it a maximum possibility of meeting that promise. So if you have someone who's making a basic important promise, then the regulations will all come to make sure that he is able to fulfill that promise. So banking is intrinsically linked with the principle of deposits being promised to be paid back, i.e. a loan, which is a loan. So the deposit gives a loan to the bank. However, let's be clear that, as he said here, that there are many Sharia-compliant financial products that are being provided by companies that are not banks. And there are mortgage lenders even that are not banks. And they've never been and have no interest in being a bank. So the lending side of the bank does not cause it to be a bank. It's the deposit taking. And that's a very important thing to understand. Now, one of the things that Dr. Ghamdi said is that the banks are quite pervasive, they're all over, they're doing a service, they're doing interest plus services, and therefore we should consider accepting that as a thing. So what I've done here is to look at the role of banks and non-banks, I'll call it, it's a generic word, in the modern economy. And all those transactions that we had identified earlier, I put them on this side, looking at under the heading transaction. And then I use JP Morgan, Citibank as a good modern large bank, and ask, is it being done by them? And as Ghamdi Saab said, absolutely right, they're all being done by this entity. Then the question comes, but does it require a banking license to do it, or is it doing it in its capacity as an entity, a legal entity in its own right? And interestingly, we get no for everything except one, which is deposit taking. Okay, so this ties into what I was saying, that you only need a banking license if you're going to be taking deposits. You could be doing all the services, all the lending, anything else you want to do without being a bank. I'm not saying that there are no licenses for other things, but they're not banking licenses. And the next column, other organizations, the types of organizations that are doing it, I've put a list. And then I've given some examples of modern day organizations that are doing that. And my argument at this point is that all of this is being done by lots of other organizations, and you don't need to be a bank to do it, which, as the Bank of England themselves said. And so I would not buy the idea that just because you're doing 50 things, we should buy those 50 things from a bank, and also buy the interest-based products also. So while I have no issue in buying all the other products which are halal, I would later on argue that that is something that I will not be recommending. He also thought, and he's expressed that they were very pervasive and doing, very large, and he even called it a foundation of modern economics. I'm challenging that, and what I did just last week is to look at the S&P 500, and I just downloaded the S&P 500, the market values of all those 500 companies. I thought, 500 is a bit much, so what I did, I cut it. I said, let's look at the top 100. In the top 100, you can see that there's 22 trillion, 21.985 billion, 22 trillion of market cap. And I've put them in reverse order. The big famous FANG 5, which are, those of you know, is the big tech companies, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, Google. I've just clubbed them together as they're so big that I don't want our discussion today to divert away to those unique subset. But what I did, I put them as the FANG 5. And then what I've done is, if you look, and I looked for the biggest bank in this group. And number 15, you've got JP Morgan as the largest cap bank in the world. And I'm talking about the Western world. I don't have the data for China and things, but let's concentrate on the Western world for the time being. So we've got JP Morgan with almost 300 billion being the largest bank. And as you see, there are organizations that are bigger than JP Morgan, and they're in all the fields, including MasterCard, Visa, Berkshire Hathaway, all of these organizations that are in the financial sector, you can say, and yet bigger. So this point that banks are very big. Then I totaled all the banks that exist in the top 100 companies, and they come to 600 billion, 632 billion. And when you take that as a percentage of the total 100 value, it's only 2.9 or 3%. So my message is that banks have been shrinking over the years. And even if I was to say within that bank, because they're conglomerates, they're doing stuff that is halal. So if I was to then further segregate the bank, it'll be actually half of that. So we're talking about 1.5% of the global economy, or the global market cap, if that can be used as a proxy for the economy, or the importance in the economy, let's say. Then effectively banks are now very small. Now, it's a big change from when I started my working life. It's a big change for everybody. But the message that I'm giving now is challenge that assumption that banks, and particularly licensed parts of the banking business, is not very big at all. Okay, what is the problem with the loaning model? Why do we want to talk about it? Now, it's not the subject of our topic, and I'll just explain why, but let me just explain what, in my opinion, what is the biggest issue with riba. And that is that loans create liabilities beyond the ownership of the asset. And the asset could have been consumed, destroyed, and not exist anymore. And that leaves a lingering liability which can go on for years and years. Now, that is the fundamental difference of a loan compared to if you buy the same thing with your equity. And that continuing liability is a major concern, and it's recognized as an ill even in the West. There's lots of literatures on it, and even in today's economics, when everyone says it's all okay, we should carry on with it. And today's politics, today's economics, there are whole movements like Occupy Wall Street that are based on this, that we need to make sure that, we've got, that ill doesn't continue. We don't need to debate it today. You can agree or disagree with me on it. And like I said, this is only one option. But the main thing is that we have to understand whether, if we don't understand why, it doesn't matter. Whether we agree with it, it doesn't matter. The prohibition is clear, and all three parties that we said are as part of this discussion have agreement on this issue. Okay, now we all understand that a simple loan was banned, and we are all accepting that. But the real challenge is understanding how you identify it when it's created through a combination of products. I.e., I'll use the generic word, it's a structured transactions. Although when we talk these days structured transactions, we think of very complicated structured transactions, but I would argue that structuring starts very, very low down. After you've got a simple loan, anything that then builds on it is, I will use the generic word, structured transactions. Now, it's something that you may not intuitively understand, and that's why I'm going to give you some examples to help you understand why we need experts to evaluate these products. If you look in the physical world, we've got hydrogen, we've got some products that join and give you a completely opposite effect. Hydrogen and oxygen both have combustion-friendly properties. Hydrogen burns itself, and we're looking at using hydrogen as a source of fuel, and oxygen, which helps it helps combustion, and these two things combine and they make water, and water is an opposite effect. It is flame quelling properties. Similarly, sodium, which is very corrosive, it explodes in water, and chlorine, which is also used for killing germs and very deadly, can combine to make common salt. So it's not something that you can understand by looking at water, that it's made up of components that are very different. And that's why you need chemical engineers, you need chemists to help us understand. That's science, but if I go to the other extreme and I look at artists, then I'm absolutely hopeless at art. I could never even draw anything that people could recognize what I'm trying to draw. So I think I'll stick with abstract art. But even there, I don't have that skill. But artists will be able to show you how the different combinations of only 3 colors, that's the blue, the red, and the yellow. With these 3 basic colors, they create a palette of millions of colors. Now, again, no one can imagine that these 3 colors can just be exploded into a million colors. The other thing I'll explain, and then we'll get on to the financial side of it, is that you have destinations and you have transits. If I was going to Timbuktu, I can take Qatar Airways, fly via Doha. I can take Emirates and fly via Dubai. However, the destination will always remain Timbuktu for me. So when my son asks me, where are we going for holiday this year, I will say Timbuktu. It's unlikely that I will say Dubai or Doha. So destinations are important. Processes and intermediaries can be ignored. Of course, if somebody asks you how you're going to get to Timbuktu, then yes, we get into that discussion. So finance experts have been over the years creating these complicated products. Now, what is the problem? How do you analyze it? Like I said, you need experts. And one of the key things that we have to now understand, that anything written by previous fuqaha is very likely to be less useful, a lot less useful to modern day products. And by modern day, I mean the last 250 years of products. And both in science and economics, as those fuqaha did not experience these products. But the Quran is forever. The Sunnah of the Prophet is a very core part of our understanding of the religion, and those will be relevant. And what I will do is relate current right back to these 2 basic sources. In between, yes, we can get some guidance, but you have to understand that you have to really lower the level of reliance on these, primarily because these are written at times when this is not they would not have seen this. And there is this thing about Imam Shafi having said that you do your fatwas based on the current products and the current reality. Now, what do I say? We talked about structured products. What does Islam say about structured products? Is it something really new, or did it exist? And what I'm suggesting that structured transactions were identified and recognized and clarified that they can contain interest and may need to be prohibited. So at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, at that point already structured transactions had started to come into existence, and very strict instructions or very strict commandments or instructions were given by the Prophet and people around him at the time that these are banned. So Bay al-Ina, for example, is, you can say it's like the first structured transaction that came, and it was immediately quashed because it was creating interest through a combination of two transactions, a sale and a buyback, with this, and that was prohibited. But what we've done is, because we want to allow some things to happen, we have narrowed the concept of structured Bay al-Ina, and there are people who even allow that, but let's say the majority of people have agreed now that Bay al-Ina is banned. And they say, oh, it's only the sale and lease back to that particular person that is banned. Okay, I mean, that could be a way of interpreting the Prophet's commandments and his sunnahs. But then, by that logic, anything he would have said would have referred to camels, to horses, and we should say now they don't apply to trains and cars. No, I think we have to understand that what was being said was what was available, and those were condemned, and we need to now relate them to here. So I would argue Bay al-Ina refers to structured transactions, and you need to look at each one of them and come back and decide whether it has interest or not. Similarly, there is a whole lot of hadith on riba al-fadl, which is interest through transactions, and there also there are permutations that have been banned. Now, again, when we want to talk about it, we say, well, these were particular products, particular types of products, they were so and so forth. I read it wider than that. Transactions involving future payments have to be looked at, and they can contain interest. Now, today, that's exactly what IFRS 15 says. It says you have interest in credit sales. You need to segregate that. So what I'm trying to explain is that is exactly what it is. Now, the good thing is that the IFRS, Basel, all these modern finance techniques are all open book. There's nothing secret in it. We have processes that we can do to work with that, and we have a way of inputting into that. So if there is anything that we feel is in FIRS that doesn't refer to the unique situation that we have a process of amending those IFRSs, adding to them, further subclassifying if need be. And that is something I would say encourage us all Muslims to use that and to do that. Why? Because then that keeps our finance integrated into the global finance, and all you're doing is finding situations that you want to have them address. Now, just because something then becomes bad for you, we can't convince them to change it, and neither we should, because if it is that, then we should accept it. And we'll give you examples of a lot. A similar example is if the accounting creates a capital gain, for example, and it's more heavily taxed in one country to the other, IFRS isn't going to then just change the regulations for each of the countries. It is a global accounting standards. Now, what it says, this is the reality, as best as we know today, best as we can evaluate today, and he requires you to then either make the laws according to that or follow the laws. So if something is banned for Muslims or the Jewish community or anybody else, that doesn't change the substance of the transactions. Now, if we have a transaction that is uniquely peculiar, we have an opportunity to make a contribution to that. Now, there are two areas that I want to talk about, which when people look at Islamic banking and all the products and everything that is designed, there are two fundamental violations that happen. And I'm going to talk about both of those. And that, to me, is the thing that we need to concentrate on when we look at the current Islamic banking. There's a notion of linked or connected transactions, and contemporary economics is clear on that, and it says connected transactions have to be treated as one transaction. But Islam says the same thing. It says the two transactions cannot be in one, and therefore there is no conflict in that principle between the both of them. So we agree on the principle, but when it comes to saying whether it's connected or not, everything I've read tries to say it is not connected when it is. Okay, so now I will ask, what is connected transaction? Then the answer that you get is they're connected if they will not be done separately. Not if they cannot be done separately, they will not be done separately. So if you take away one part of that connected transaction setup, the whole transaction will stop. Or at least it will be negotiated, renegotiated, and you'll have another transaction. But that particular agreement that was happening will stop. And again, you look at the actual practice and not what the legal contract says. And if you can use statistics, correlation. Now, I am saying here, let's look at data analysis for some of these. And the real culprit here is this unilateral promise. Whether it's a hiba, whether it's a unilateral promise, these are the things that are creating the linkage, and we want to say there is no linkage. Now we look at reality, so how do we do it in today's day and world? You just do some data analysis. So what is the data analysis that I would look at? How many unilateral promises have I issued in my life other than for Islamic banking transaction? If anybody has, I would like to meet him. So the fact that you're issuing a unilateral promise only for Islamic banking transactions, you've got to ask yourself that, there must be a linkage. Then ask the bank operations staff, is this unilateral promise filed in the same loan file? Because if they're independent, you would file all the unilateral promises in somewhere else, and you would file your loan file somewhere else. Why do you want to put this in the same file? I would ask the auditors, is it in your checklist that you have to go check it exists? So all of these things tell you that it's connected. The other thing one can do is look at big data again. We must have done 1 million plus, or I don't know how many, ijara transactions across the banking industry, Islamic banking industry over the past 20 years. And how many of the cars were sold to the same customer that did the rental, let's say? And how many did we sell to other customers or to non-customers? You can do the statistics, you can look at, with the odd exception, I would say there's a big zero that was done with non-connected customers. No car has ever been sold to a non-connected person. So statistics like that don't lie. I challenge you to look at it from that point of view. The other principle, which is totally agreed between both modern finance and Islamic finance, that the value of assets or service should always be related to the market price. And there's so many sunnats of sanctity of the market and the market pricing. And this concept is fully aligned. We do hear some Sharia scholars explaining when they are talking about Islamic finance, saying, it's my good, I can sell it at any price I want. Yes, theoretically, possibly that's a statement of probably fact. But then it will not be a business, not necessarily be a business. Because it will be impossible for any businessman to continuously offer products at off-market prices. And that's because if you're selling it expensive, you will run out of customers. And if you sell it cheap, you're going to run out of suppliers. So where there is an off-market price, we've been trained as accountants, as auditors, as normal day-to-day transactions. You've got to ask the question. And when you ask the question, you will get the answer. Because there's this management techniques that we learned. Ask why 5 times. So like somebody walks into your bank and says, oh, I want to buy rice. You say, why? And then you say, I want to buy rice to sell. You say, why? And then you'll come to the final answer that I want to buy rice, which I don't have anything to do with, to sell it immediately so that I get some money and I go off and do what I want to do with it. So you just ask the questions. You ask 5 times, you'll get the answer. So you ask the question on why are you doing off-market price, and you'll know very soon whether it is a misrepresentation, whether it's exploitation, whether it's stealing by under or over invoicing. It could be offering a bribe, and someone could be genuinely charitable. All of these are not all wrong, they're not all haram, but the fact is there is something behind there that you have to investigate. And if it is, it's likely to be a connected transaction. So, when products are built up, you need to keep these in mind, and then you do that. Now, how do we test? How do we segregate, how do we identify? And the thing that I'm saying today is that it is very easy. And the way it is easy is that you've got testing and instruments in our daily life. Something we are very familiar with and we're comfortable with in our daily life. In fact, we trust those measurements in our daily affairs, even when our life depends on it. For example, you're flying on an aeroplane, and somebody says, I'm flying level 4-1, flight level 4-1, another plane coming the other side, he will be on flight 40, and they'll cross each other with utter confidence because you know and you trust the instruments. No Muslim I am aware of has ever denied these results based on religious reasoning. So in finance we can use the same, we look at the testing and instrumentation processes. And what are they? There are systems by which you input all the financial information, you do some testing, and then you get the output. And that is the process I'm going to show you in a minute. It's not difficult. Of course, there are going to be some doubtful areas. Now, there are 2 ways of doing it. One is to just leave it and say, okay, if it's doubtful, I give the benefit of doubt either this side or that side. Or you can do further testing that is more accurate. So you get the doctor doing let's say an ECG for just checking your heart. If it's okay, he'll say, fine, go home. If you find something that he needs for the investigation, he will say, do an ETT. He'll then say, do an MRI or some other modern techniques. So the more you find out and the more important it is to get to the bottom of it, you can do more work. But I'm not suggesting that. I think there is enough at the broad level that we can work with. And the sunnahs that I've quoted here are both very clear that there'll always be black, there'll always be white. In between there will be some shades of grey. You will define some this side, you will define some side, and you will have to leave some if that is the issue. And here I am showing some examples of the techniques and the places where we use it all the time: weighing scale, altimeter, and even something like gold. When you want to measure the purity of gold, there are many techniques, and the most modern and accurate one they're saying is the X-ray fluorescence spectrometer. I didn't know about it, I just Googled it and this information came out. So don't ask me to operate that system. And then on the financial side, I am arguing that the auditors who look at the financial products against a benchmark and give you the result. So we have the processes already in place. So what is the process? You input your data, anything that's connected due to conditionality or practice is brought into the domain, and you look at it in totality. You select an independent group of auditors, you test the cash flow, and if the cash flows match that of a simple debt, that's the benchmark, it gives the output clearly and honestly. If you don't like it, the result, you can take multiple samples, you can change the auditors and retest. And you confirm, yes, it is still saying that there is interest here. And I would suggest to anybody who wants to talk about this subject, after having done all of that, if it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, then it is a duck. And that, unfortunately, we have to work with. Like I said, I did the first presentation in 2003, and this is, and I'm going to use some slides from that presentation just to show you how nothing has changed in 20 years. And whatever we're going to believe in, we're going to believe in. No one is going to come and give us any. Unfortunately, we want to challenge that, and here's the thing that, for example, from 2003, my presentation, and the reason I'm using some of the slides directly from that presentation is because I want to show that nothing has changed in all of this time, and nothing else new is going to come. You can expect, we're not going to expect much change in the basics that we are discussing. Going back then, Islamic banking license being considered by UK's FSA. And he said the challenge is to find ways that produce the same impact for Islamic banks for its universal investment accounts, deposits, as for a conventional deposit. So he said we want to find assurance that it will be promised to be paid back, and the lawyers are working on it. And as soon as they find a solution to this, we can issue a license. So, in effect, what he's saying is that this is the rule. Now you come up and show us how you meet the rule, and then we will give you a license. Of course, we have Islamic banking's licenses issued by the FSA, so we must have succeeded in giving the FSA satisfaction that it is a promise. And that is the key point. Another key point today that I want you to take away, that Islamic banking as practiced by us all today, it relies on this duplicity, let's say, that we want to say one thing to the regulators and to the tax authorities and anybody who's controlling it, and we want to say another thing to the customers. Two examples I've put here. One is for the tax authorities in the UK and one in Ireland, apart from the Bank of England, that one I gave you earlier. And there you can see that we have been convincing these authorities that they are the same. And this is the press release that they put out in March 2010 saying that this is what they're trying to do. And what they have done ensures equality of treatment between Islamic financial products and their conventional counterparts. These products are the same in substance as conventional financial products. And then they go on to say that it doesn't remove the differentiation between a bank and traders. And notice that even the underlining is theirs, that all we are doing is looking at these products as identical to their conventional counterparts. Similarly, the UK said that they are removing regulatory obstacles to level the playing field between Islamic and conventional finance. Now, the question that arises that when we are dealing with regulators, legal authorities, taxation, why do we want to be equated with interest products? And why don't we want to be equated with non-interest products? So you've got to ask yourself that you're standing and wanting to stand with the group of interest-based products as defined by them, and yet you're trying to say we're not interest-based. Now, I say you're judged by the friends you keep, so that's what you're doing. Now, if I was arguing, I would be arguing for allowing the trade modes to become as advantageous as the debt products. In my solution section, when we get to it, that's exactly the approach I'm taking. I am going through and listing all the advantages that debt has compared to non-debt, and then I'm challenging all of those. It's as simple as that. And you know, this is stuff that the West teaches its 101 economics class, the 101 accounting class. Why is debt attractive to companies? Now, if we can understand that, we have the solution, and we'll come to that later. This is the issue that you've got to test it, you've got to understand it. Again, this is 2003 slide, and I had said that Allen and Overy, which is one of the largest and the most professional legal firms working on a sukuk, and at this time, remember, their only sukuks were about 2 billion, 3 billion, and this was the largest issue that was coming up. So huge interest of everybody in it. I also received the 500-page document, and then I saw the press release. If a lawyer firm as reputed as that, who worked on this 500-page document, puts out a press release and says, this is what you need to understand, this is what's important out of all of this 500 pages, then I would say, I don't need to read 500 pages. I can look at the information given here and tell you this is a debt product. Now, you want to go into more detail? I can go into more detail. I've read all those 500 pages. I can pinpoint exactly where the issue is. And the basic two issues are exactly the same that I identified the violations in my earlier part of my presentation. You will see that you have to check whether it meets the market pricing test. So when you sell an airport to a SPV, when you set lease payments, when you set purchase price, are they related to the market in any way or form at all? Maybe one of them might be, maybe the original valuation might be, but there's no bidding, there's no process, there's no nothing. And the other big failure is that you actually have conditional transactions, i.e. if there was no government guarantee to buy it back, unilateral or whatever you want to call it, the transaction would stop. So violations of fundamental principles of Islamic law are built into this product. Now, I know Sharia scholars try to justify it, but the reality is these are violations that cannot be explained away, other than our goodwill as customers. Okay, now coming back to testing. How am I going to use this testing? And what I'm saying here, you want to use the IFRS as a good benchmark. And we'll discuss why I think it's a good benchmark, but let's take that for a minute, saying that that is the best knowledge that the West has at the moment. I put that as the benchmark. I take the best auditors in the world, one of the big four, and I give him the input, and he gives me a result. And the question is this riba free or is this interest free? And the answer will be either a yes, which is a green tick, or no, a red cross. So I give you some working through this. Now, if I'm looking at a house acquisition, Ghamdi Saab said, let's take mortgage as an example, and it's fantastically structured, it's acceptable. And what happens, this firm of auditors, this testing system gives me a fail on the mortgage. I then give him diminishing musharaka, it gives me a fail. I give him shared ownership, it gives me a pass. I give him rent plus an Islamic mutual fund, and it gives me a pass. So you can rent for a period, make your savings somewhere else, and then buy it at the end if that's what you want to do. Now, that's the result of the model. Now, like it or not, that's what you will get. Similarly for transport, ijara, I do a car hire purchase. Again, Ghamdi Saab's suggestion that this is absolutely acceptable. It is not it is riba. It's not riba free. Includes riba, and therefore it fails. The car ijara model of our modern Islamic banking, it also fails. Then you have Avis or Uber model that passes, and that more or less meets your transport requirement at this point. And I would argue that you should not want to own a car, but still, if you want to own a car, you can rent for the short period and do a saving plan that allows you to buy it at a later stage. Deposits, again, bank deposits fail, collective investment vehicles of Islamic banks fail, unit trusts pass, and joint ventures and musharaka pass. Credit card fails, debit card on saving accounts, which is interest-based, fails, debit card of current accounts passes, and debit cards on unit trust accounts passes. So my point here is, well, let me just finish. So my point here is that you have a testing mechanism, it gives you the answer. Your choice is to either, and I've got some slides on that, but basically my message is that you accept it and you adjust your actions accordingly. Sukuks and bonds, if I put it through the same testing machine, what do I get? Bonds fail. Sukuks, I want a bit more analysis, so I've put in 100 sukuks. 98 fail. 2 pass, for example. So what do? I say, okay, maybe there's something wrong. Why did these pass? I said this, all sukuks should fail. No, that's not the point. You have to look at each offered product as it is. And then I say, okay, let me test it with a new set of auditors. And those 2 sukuks that passed, again pass. And those 98 that failed, still failed. So then I ask myself, why do some sukuks pass this IFRS test? And the answer is that first question you ask, is it a general purpose instrument or an SPV? If it is an SPV, then it's a connected transaction, special purpose, means connected. And then you have to test in totality. If it's a general purpose vehicle or general purpose instrument, then you test in isolation. And then you will test the use at a later stage. In this example, let's say 99 were SPVs. Of them, 1 was a general purpose. And 1 was general purpose. Out of the 99, 98 failed due to the asset deployment. Not because the sukuk concept was wrong, but the asset deployment was wrong. And the reason that we've already talked about those assets that are within the sukuks, either ijara, diminishing musharaka, so because they failed, the sukuk structure failed. The 1 sukuk that passed was for the car rental model, let's say, Hertz car model rental. So that's how that would work. Now, if I look at the general purpose, an example would be the general purpose sukuk that passed, and Ehad sukuk issued by Islamic Bank very recently would pass the IFRS test, which is fantastic. But what is it? It's a fully paid up, rated, perpetual, unsecured, unsubordinated, and contingent convertible instrument. Despite all that definition, or because of whichever way you want to look at, with all those definitions and adjectives, it passes. And why does it pass? Because the benchmark for sukuks is a shareholding. And the preference share IFRS is number 32, and it simply says nice and beautifully that the fundamental principle is that it should either be classified as a financial liability or an equity instrument, according to the substance of the transaction, not its legal form. A financial instrument is an equity instrument only if the instrument includes no contractual obligation to deliver cash or another financial asset to another entity. And then they're given an example. And because Bank Islami Ehad Sukuk meets these terms conditions that they are not promising to return the money on any contractual basis, they have their puts and so on and so forth, they can do it if Bank Islami wants, but the customer who is giving the money is not entitled under any circumstances to call it back. The profit can move up and down, it can be stopped, but that's not a key deciding factor. So we have the opportunity to structure transactions that will pass. And what solution do we come up with? We create a new benchmark called AOFI. Islamic banking comes up with a new structure called AOFI. And interestingly, you put your ijara through it, it passes. You put your diminishing musharaka through it, it passes. You put your collective investments account, it passes. You put all sukuks and they pass. So I'm saying here in red, should we not visit the IOFI standards to check if they have properly considered the 2 issues that I had mentioned earlier? that off-market pricing and connected transactions have not been done in these transactions, and then we will realize that there's very little substances, and in this case they will pass. Am I being critical of AOFI? Yes, I am. Am I saying it's incorrect? Yes, I am. And I'm not saying that there's bad intention there. I think the intention is sound. People want to give alternatives, but I think we are being a bit naive, you can say, or want to brush things under the carpet, whatever words you want to use. The IOP standard is not something that can stand the test of anything. And we say, as Muslims, we believe that the Quran was the final book revealed to mankind, and Muhammad Prophet ﷺ was the last prophet. However, Allah's task of providing guidance to the human race is not stopped. It will continue. And this is a statement I made. Allah has stopped sending books and prophets. He now sends knowledge and inventions. And the onus is on us to be sensitive to this new inventions and new knowledge, and strive to relate it to the instructions of the Prophet, of the Quran, and the Sunnah of the Prophet. So my main message to both Taqi Usmani and Dr. Ghamdi is that Muslims do not need to redefine what is already clearly defined. There's very little in the definitions that we need to challenge or change. It is totally consistent with today's modern finance. The West, and recognize that the global accounting and finance literature over the past 100 years or so has not been written to propagate interest. It has been written to identify and segregate interest. And why have they done it? Because it is a fundamental core principle in their own science of economics or science of business. The ROE, return on equity. If you cannot define equity, then all of your calculations, all of your valuations, they are going to be haywire. So this is something that is very important to them. And as I said earlier, when something is important to you, you will write books and books on it. And the West has done that for us. We have to just understand it, accept that it is in conformity with our own religion, and follow it honestly. So I ask the question, if an independent test by an unbiased process is telling that something has interest in it or riba in it, why should we deny that? And here I recall the famous ayat of Surah Rahman, then which of the blessings of your Lord will you both deny? And here the Lord has enabled us to have this clarity and processes defined. So I say that Ghamdi Saab's suggestions and the Islamic banking solution fail these tests, and we need to re-evaluate our approaches. Sadly, this is exactly what someone at an Islamic banking conference is saying to us. An independent person who you invite to an Islamic banking conference says that, we have been opinion shopping. Opinion shopping means you ask lots of people and then you choose whichever one is easy for you, despite the majority or the logic being against it. I'm not saying that you should not be challenging the results. If we don't like the results, we feel there's something wrong, by all means, let's look at the process of challenge. And it can't be by changing the IOFI standard that it, just redefine what everything is and miss out some crucial parts of this process. So there is a process. If we don't like the result, we can challenge everything in this process. You're entitled to challenge the sample, you're entitled to challenge the detector, the calibrator, benchmark, everything is up for challenge. So please don't take away from what I said that we accept the West and we follow the West. That is not what I'm saying. All I'm saying is understand what the West does, challenge it, but challenge it in a rational and scientific way. Don't shy away from the reality. So if you were caught in a breathalyzer You can sample, you can say this was not my sample. Okay, they'll take another sample, that solves that problem. You can say this machine is inaccurate. Okay, we can change the machine. You can say the definition is not right. Maybe I'm looking at it in miles per hour, or somebody's looking at it in kilometers per second, whatever. So that can be sorted. So everything can be sorted. But once we have satisfied that we have challenged everything that is to be challenged, but then accept the result. And that's the real challenge that we have to ask ourselves. And of course, you can challenge the law itself. Why is there a law? Why do I have to be getting a corona test done? Why should I not have more than prescribed amount of alcohol if I'm driving? Yes, you can challenge that law, and there's a process for that. But often it can lead to conflict or war, and the Quran in 279 has warned of that impending war. And God forbid we shouldn't be looking to that direction. And if we did want to challenge the results, do we as Islamic banking industry, as currently in vogue, do we have a case? And Mahmoud Al-Gamal is a very learned person in finance and Islamic finance. He's a professor at Rice University. He was advisor to the US government on Islamic finance. And you can read here whatever he has said. And I'm not going to read it, but basically he's saying exactly what I'm saying, that by trying to hide it, you're denying one reality, you're creating more problems, and you're also exposing yourself to being irrational in our approach. S&P Global Ratings on the 7th of July said that now defaults will help you decide whether there is some substance in sukuks that we have issued or not. And they're saying that basically there is no assets underlying those sukuks, and that if there is, it is an exception rather than the rule. And the one that passed probably was that exception that she's talking about. So, very serious challenge if you want to do that. Now, I want to just reiterate at this point, I'm not suggesting that there is no Islamic banking. In fact, as I showed, everything that's being done is almost nowadays 95% is on non-riba basis, and it's not being done by banks. So therefore my message to the Muslims is that just like you leave khinzir or swine and choose the other halal options, similarly let the identification tell you what is interest-based, and then you choose things that are not, and you choose it from entities that don't have to be bank